The Ukraine invasion isn't going well for Russia. That much is evident from the fact that it's still ongoing, even though Vladimir Putin thought it would all be done and dusted in a matter of days. Ukraine's brave resistance has weakened Russia, but at least Putin can console himself with the knowledge that he is fighting an enemy outside of Russia's borders. Not anymore. Ukrainians aren't the only fighters that Russia's leader has to worry about. There are partisans inside Russia itself, and they are very active. Putin has been betrayed from within, as a group of Russians has just crippled the Kremlin's war machine. Those Russians call themselves the Freedom of Russia Legion, and they have been active from the moment that Putin launched his Ukraine invasion. We'll dig deeper into what the group is and what it does later. For now, it's enough to know that the Freedom of Russia Legion opposes Putin's regime so fiercely that it's willing to fight for Ukraine to get him out of power. That's precisely what the group did in early November, as the Kyiv Post reports. On November 6th, the outlet shared a story describing how the Freedom of Russia Legion has just carried out a wave of attacks across Russia, all of which targeted Russia's locomotives. Russia's train lines are the arteries that crisscross the country and make it possible for Putin to wage his war. The country's locomotives are the lifeblood, and dozens of them are now burning thanks to a series of sabotage operations targeting trains that carry weapons and ammunition from Russia and into Ukraine. The Freedom of Russia Legion has confirmed the attacks, so too has Ukraine's main intelligence directorate, or HUR. The latter raising its voice implies that HUR has been working alongside the partisan movement operating inside Russia, perhaps by providing it with guidance on which targets it can strike to do the most damage to the Russian war machine. That's speculation, of course, but what isn't speculative is that the Legion has pulled off a spectacular sabotage operation right under Putin's nose. HUR provides some of the details in a Telegram post that confirms the success of the attacks. The Freedom of Russia resistance movement against the Kremlin regime has conducted a series of successful operations targeting the enemy's logistical infrastructure, HUR reported before confirming how the movement managed to pull off its attacks. There were no missiles or other complex weapons of war involved. All that Freedom of Russia needed were some flammable liquids and matches. The partisans' Molotov cocktails incinerated the control and power supply systems of dozens of vehicles that provided transportation of military cargo, HUR adds. This statement tells us two things. First, the Freedom of Russia Legion got up close and personal with the trains it was sabotaging. That either means that members of the group are working on Russia's rails, or the trains that the Kremlin relies on to keep the gears of its war machine turning are being left so exposed that unauthorized people can sneak onto them. Second, HUR is clearly in contact with the Russian resistance movement. The last few months in particular have seen Ukraine conduct multiple strikes inside Russia that are designed to cripple Putin's supply lines. Most of those strikes have focused on Russia's refineries and energy sector, with the most recent happening on the same day as HUR confirmed the train attacks. But with these sabotage operations, we're now seeing Ukraine expand its scope, with the help of partisans, to hit the vehicles that deliver the oil and crucial equipment throughout Russia and to the front lines. This wasn't a random attack, it was carefully coordinated, and Ukraine knew it was happening long before Putin and his cronies realized that dozens of their trains were burning. The story wouldn't be complete without a statement from the movement itself. The Freedom of Russia Legion is proud of the attack that it just pulled off. It's also taken to Telegram to confirm its sabotage operation and to deliver a message to Putin that whatever he may think about Russian support for his illegal operation is wrong. Many Russians oppose him, and they're willing to put themselves at risk to support Ukraine. While those for whom everything has already been decided sit back on their comfortable sofas doing nothing, we are taking action and reaching a new level, the Legion said in a statement that appears to be aimed at other Russians who don't support Putin but are perhaps too scared to resist him directly. We have destroyed dozens of locomotives transporting weapons, ammunition, and equipment to the front. The Legion capped off its Telegram post with a warning to Putin. The Legion's resistance continues to grow stronger and expand across the country. Putin's scum will live in fear and forget what security means. Nowhere in Russia is safe from this partisan movement. And Putin can't do a thing about it because the Kremlin has no idea who these people are or exactly where they operate. The nameless and the faceless in Russia are rising up against their leader, and they're doing it by taking part in operations that support Ukraine's strategy of crippling Russia from the inside. The Kremlin has its work cut out for it when it comes to putting a spin on the situation. Normally, Russia would deny and deny again, acting like nothing had happened, or the lost locomotives were scheduled to be destroyed. It can't do that this time because there is footage of the Freedom of Russia Legion's operation. Shared by the Kyiv Independent, the minute-long video demonstrates that the Legion's sabotage was a true grassroots effort. The first few seconds are shot from the perspective of some of the group's partisans who film their view of the flammable liquid that they pour inside the trains they target. After that, we see the results. Train after train aflame. Gasoline is lit, Molotov cocktails are thrown. Every single train appears to be unguarded and vulnerable, which is a massive lapse in security from a country that relies so heavily on rail to keep itself running. It almost looks like it was too easy. But far more likely is that HUR and the Freedom of Russia Legion spent weeks, perhaps even months, selecting specific trains that they knew could be accessed and were likely to be used by Russia to transport weapons and ammunition to Ukraine. The video switches between sabotages so quickly that it's difficult to get a bead on how many trains the Freedom of Russia Legion struck during the dead of night. Thankfully, we don't have to rely on footage to find out more. The Kyiv Post report offers a full breakdown of every location where the Legion struck, that shows us that this was a Russia-wide operation in keeping with the Legion's claim that it's growing to a point where the Kremlin can no longer contain it. The list goes on and on. The Legion struck in the Moscow region, taking out a train in Arkhangelskoye. Samara was the target for several strikes as trains were sabotaged in Syzran, Tolyatti, Bezanchuk, and Kinel-Cherkassky. In the Komi Republic, the rebels took out a train in Syktyvkar, and in Kemerovo, a train in Novokuznetsk was sent to the Great Rails in the sky. Sverdlovsk was among the heaviest hit regions, along with Samara, as the Freedom of Russia Legion took out trains in Bilimbai, Bogdanovich, Pavlorsk, and Nizhny Tagil. And that's not all. The partisan group is smart enough to realize that its Russian members can operate as freely in the occupied regions of Ukraine as they can in Russia itself. Members took advantage of that fact by burning up trains in the Donetsk and Kherson regions, showing Putin that his forces aren't even safe from the country's own people in the territory they have stolen from Ukraine. This was a massive operation. The Freedom of Russia Legion was also carrying on the good work done by another Ukrainian partisan movement, Artesh. As the Kyiv Post reports, Artesh has been involved in several similar railway sabotages throughout Russia. Again, the target is to disrupt the flow of equipment to the front lines of the Ukraine war. The group's most recent attack saw it destroy a railway line in the Chuvash Republic, which forced a temporary halting of a military train. It's also targeted trains and tracks in the Rostov region and Yekaterinburg. We mentioned earlier that HUR's mention of the Freedom of Russia Legion's attacks implied some coordination. Artesh's sabotage operations suggest that this coordination runs deeper than it seems. We have two separate partisan groups that are targeting Russia's rails with precise operations that are doing maximum damage to Putin's military logistics. This is no coincidence. These aren't random attacks. They are military operations being conducted by groups that have a very clear mission to knock out Russia's supply lines, and they're succeeding. That shouldn't come as a surprise once you learn a little more about what the Freedom of Russia Legion is. Back in June 2023, Reuters wrote a profile about the Legion after it had completed a spate of attacks in the Russian region of Belgorod on Ukraine's behalf. It says that the Legion was formed in the spring of 2022, and it quotes the group as stating that it was created out of the wish of Russians to fight in the ranks of the armed forces of Ukraine against Putin's armed gang. In other words, the Legion's members will be fighting in the Ukrainian army if they could. Given that joining Ukraine's military directly isn't an option, they're working alongside Ukraine inside Russia, providing vital intelligence and sabotage links in the process. The group claims to operate directly under Ukraine's command, which pretty much confirms HUR's involvement in the events of early November. Modern Insurgent provides more information, noting that the group consists mostly of Russian immigrants and ex-members of the Russian armed forces, so there is experience circulating throughout the group, as well as a cause. It adds that the Freedom of Russia Legion is an official unit in the International Legion of Territorial Defense of Ukraine. Right now, we don't know how big the Legion really is. When it was first formed, the group was about 100 strong, with all members being Russian army soldiers who had defected to Ukraine's side. But now, the group likely has thousands of members. It would have to in order to pull off the dozens of sabotage operations on locomotives across Russia that it and HUR have just revealed. Modern Insurgent provides some estimates. Just months after announcing its creation, the Legion claims it received as many as 300 applications in a single day. An accurate assessment of the Legion's current manpower has yet to be released. The resource estimates the group's numbers at anywhere between 500 and 2,000, who are actively participating in combat operations, and there may be many more working behind the scenes. This estimate does not include Legion members who are operating inside Ukraine, and there are clearly plenty of them, given that November saw train attacks in Kherson and Donetsk. This is a shadowy organization, a group that Putin can't see and barely understands. The only thing Russia's leader knows for sure is that the Freedom of Russia Legion has betrayed everything that Putin stands for. Its members are unknown, and that gives Putin a serious problem. How do you stop a group that is so good at hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike? You don't. and that means that plenty of other infrastructure that is crucial to Russia's war effort is still at risk. Let's come back to Russia's burning locomotives. Russia will be furious that it's lost these trains for two reasons. It's already dealing with a locomotive shortage, and Russia is completely reliant on its trains for almost everything that the country transports. Starting with the shortage, the Kyiv Post says that Russia has been dealing with reduced locomotive availability and freight capacity since late 2023, all due to Western sanctions. The West's restrictions on what these companies can buy from outside of Russia mean that the components and parts that these companies need to carry out maintenance and repair are in short supply. Russian Railways has been dealing with the problem for about 2 years, the outlet says, and its repair times have skyrocketed as a result. The company operates about 20,000 trains via two companies. Locotech handles 3/4 of Russian Railways train stock, with the rest being operated by STM service. Both companies reported difficulties obtaining specialized lubricants, bearings, and electronic components due to sanctions, while staff shortages from mobilization have worsened the problem, the Kyiv Post reports. It looks like Russia's biggest rail companies were already struggling thanks to sanctions and a lack of workers. Having their trains burned beyond repair will only make a bad situation even worse. Novaya Gazeta exposed the full scale of Russia's train problems in a July piece that claims there is severe dysfunction within the Russian rail system. It says that the first 12 months of the Ukraine invasion saw train-based transport of several key categories of goods, including raw materials, collapse due to the West's sanctions. Total freight transport across Russia's freight network fell by 4% in 2022. It stabilized in 2023 but fell by another 4% in 2024 and appears to be on a similar track in 2025. By July, Russia's rail shipments had declined for 20 consecutive months, wreaking havoc on domestic and war-related operations. There are also crew problems, a lot of them. By mid-2025, Russian railways have been dealing with a shortfall of 3,000 locomotive crews and 2,500 engineers. That leaves around 200 trains in its stockpiles simply unable to run. The company still has a surplus of carriages, hundreds of thousands of them in fact, but 300,000 of those carriages are now sitting unused in the company's rail network. And more may join them now that the Freedom of Russia Legion has destroyed so many of the locomotives that pull those carriages. Those with a sense of humor could even claim that the Legion has done Russia's major rail company a service. It's gotten rid of trains that Russian railways may have been struggling to use. The point of all this is that Russia's train network is struggling. To stand any chance of recovering, it needs heavy investment in more locomotives, workers, and basic infrastructure. That need for investment only rises when groups like Freedom of Russia Legion and Artesh are destroying the very things that Russia needs more of. This all matters for the second reason why Russia is so furious with what the Freedom of Russia Legion just pulled off. Russia relies heavily on its railways, perhaps more heavily than many realize. The train network is everything in the world of Russian logistics, as Kasper Sukand pointed out in a December 2024 analysis of the Russian rail network. He called that network the Iron Leviathan, and he noted that Russia maintains about 122,000 kilometers or around 75,800 miles of railways. That network is responsible for transporting a staggering 90% of all Russia's cargo. The extent to which the Kremlin's war effort relies on the railway infrastructure cannot be overstated. The Russian armed forces are entirely dependent on the network to move troops and equipment, Sukand writes. Putin has put a lot of eggs in the Russian rail basket. The Freedom of Russia Legion has just broken a whole bunch of those eggs. Russia's Iron Leviathan, as massive as it may be, is extremely vulnerable to sabotage and aerial assaults. We mentioned earlier that it seems strange that nobody was available to stop the Freedom of Russia saboteurs from carrying out their work. The reason for this may partially come down to the employee shortages we mentioned earlier. However, Russia's sheer size and, by extension, the vastness of its rail network likely also played a part. We've already seen the problems that Russia's size causes due to Ukraine's bombing campaigns, the Atlantic Council reported in September. What was once the country's greatest asset, especially in the era when countries that tried to invade Russia via the ground had to navigate literally millions of square miles to take territory, has now become one of its greatest weaknesses. In the case of Ukraine's aerial campaigns, Russia's inability to defend the majority of its skies has come into very clear focus. Apparently, the same is true for the 75,800 square miles of rail the country has to maintain. That's a whole lot of miles to defend for a country that has lost over 1.14 million people in Ukraine, has many hundreds of thousands more fighting in the country, and is dealing with a crisis that is seeing its population decline rapidly. Gaps are starting to form in a defense that was already far from comprehensive, and Ukraine is taking advantage of those gaps by way of partisan groups like the Freedom of Russia Legion. Adding to all of this the fact that Putin is now being forced to deal with a war that's being waged inside his own country. The Freedom of Russia Legion is among the most active anti-Putin groups inside Russia, as Euromaidan Press points out. However, it's far from the only one. Putin has had to deal with rebellion before, most notably in 2023, when Wagner mercenaries rebelled against Moscow and seized the Rostov-on-Don Oblast. Those mercenaries were going to march on Moscow before the rebellion was quashed. Still, that insurrection offered one of the most prominent hints of dissent against Putin's leadership growing during the Ukraine war. Now, Russia's rebels are underground and fighting in the shadows. Newsweek notes that the Freedom of Russia Legion is joined by groups like the Russian Volunteer Corps, Siberian Battalion, and the previously mentioned Artesh. Putin already has his hands full with a Ukrainian military that is a long way from the total collapse he expected to occur years ago. With these groups battling against him from inside Russia itself, Putin's paranoia can only grow. After all, these are just the groups that are actively fighting against Russia's president. How many more of the country's people oppose Putin and his Ukraine invasion? It's a question to which Putin may never receive an accurate answer, and that will only feed into his paranoia. Russia's president knows that he's losing his grip, and he's responding with purges that are sending the Kremlin into freefall. Groups outside of his inner circle are doing plenty of damage, but even those whom Putin claims to trust are now starting to look like enemies. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more coverage of the partisan groups that are aiding the Ukrainian war effort. And thank you for watching.